Am I the jerk for telling my mom I'm a slut? That's the question I keep asking myself. It's a bold thing to say, I know, but before you judge me, let me explain. My relationship with my mom has always been complicated. It's a paradox, really. We're incredibly close, yet our views on life couldn't be further apart. That clash creates friction, constant friction. Let me paint the scene for you. My mom is a 46-year-old woman, deeply religious, newly divorced, and firmly rooted in the belief that a woman's worth is tied to marriage. Me? I'm 21, independent, and uninterested in conforming to traditional expectations. The tension between us has always been there, simmering just under the surface. But recently, it boiled over. The fight wasn't out of nowhere. It had been building up for weeks, maybe months. I'd started seeing someone new after 2 years of being single, a conscious decision I made to focus on myself. This relationship was something I was excited about, but also hesitant to share with her. Based on her history of overstepping boundaries in my previous relationship, I knew bringing him around would be opening a door I wasn't ready to step through. Yet, I eventually caved. I introduced him during New Year's Eve, and while she was polite at first, the aftermath wasn't pretty. She started making wild assumptions, accusing me of things that weren't even remotely true. It felt like no matter how I tried to protect my relationship from her scrutiny, it wasn't enough. So here I am, questioning everything. Was I wrong to finally snap? Did I cross a line? Or was I just defending myself from someone who refuses to respect my choices? Let me tell you the whole story, and you decide. To understand this story, you need to understand me. I'm 21 years old, the eldest daughter in a household shaped by strong opinions and traditional values. But I've always been my own person, carving out a path that works for me, even when it doesn't align with the expectations of others, especially my mom's. I wouldn't say I'm rebellious. I don't go out of my way to break rules or stir drama. Instead, I'm focused on living authentically. For me, relationships aren't a means to an end, like marriage or societal approval. They're about connection, mutual respect, and personal growth. This perspective didn't come out of nowhere. It's a result of my experiences and my observations of others, including my mom. You see, I'm not the kind of person who rushes into relationships. I was single for 2 years before meeting my current boyfriend. Those 2 years were intentional. I needed time to focus on myself, heal, and figure out what I truly wanted. It wasn't about bitterness or fear of relationships. It was about self-prioritization. When I finally did meet someone, it felt natural. There was no urgency, no societal clock ticking in the background. But I knew this new chapter in my life would come with its own challenges, especially because of how my mom views relationships. She believes a woman should aspire to marriage and that relationships must always move in that direction. It's a stark contrast to my perspective. I don't need a relationship to validate my worth or complete my identity. And yet, despite our differences, I wanted to navigate this situation without conflict. I wanted peace. But peace, as I've learned, isn't always an option when two worldviews clash so deeply. My approach to relationships, the independence I value, and the boundaries I set, they're all points of contention between us. And the closer I've gotten to my boyfriend, the clearer it's become that my choices that make me happy, don't sit well with her. This is who I am: independent, realistic, and unapologetic. But my mother, she sees me through a lens I don't recognize, and that's where the trouble begins. My mom is a complex person, and to understand our story, you have to understand her. She's 46, recently divorced, and deeply rooted in her faith. For her, religion isn't just a belief system, it's the foundation of her identity. Everything she does, every opinion she forms, is shaped by it. She grew up in a generation and environment where a woman's success was often measured by her ability to maintain a perfect family. To her, marriage isn't just a partnership. It's a badge of honor, a sign of respectability. It's ironic, really, considering her own marriage ended in betrayal after 20 years. My father, the so-called family man, cheated on her and moved on within a year of their divorce. But instead of rethinking her values, my mom doubled down on them. She believes that women should focus on securing a stable relationship with a serious man, someone who can provide, commit, and, in her words, bring dignity to a woman's life. That belief system makes my independence difficult for her to accept. When I was single, she would encourage me to meet someone. But the moment I entered a relationship, her expectations became suffocating. She wanted me to bring my boyfriend home regularly, involve him in family life, and act as if we were already building a future together. The problem is, I don't live my life by her rules. I value my space, and I don't think a relationship needs to meet her timeline to be valid. But to her, my reluctance to follow her lead is an affront, a rejection of her values. And when she feels rejected, she lashes out. Her words cut deep, her assumptions sting, and her inability to understand my choices creates a rift that feels impossible to bridge. After 2 years of being single, I finally met someone who felt right. He's kind, supportive, and understanding, everything I'd hoped for. We took things slowly, getting to know each other without rushing into labels or expectations. But even as the relationship blossomed, I knew introducing him to my mom would be a challenge. My hesitation wasn't baseless. During my previous relationship, my mom's behavior created unnecessary drama. Every argument I had with my ex became fuel for her judgments. She'd take his side when it suited her, or twist situations to make me feel guilty. It was exhausting, and I didn't want a repeat of that experience. But my boyfriend was eager to meet her. He believed it was an important step, a way to show his commitment and integrate into my life. I hesitated for weeks, torn between wanting to protect the peace in my relationship and respecting his wishes. Eventually, I relented. I invited him over for New Year's Eve, a safe, neutral occasion where the focus would be on celebration rather than scrutiny. At first, it went better than I expected. My mom was polite, welcoming even, and the evening passed without any overt tension. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd been overthinking things, but the relief was short-lived. In the days that followed, my mom's true feelings emerged. She began to make snide comments about our relationship, questioning why I didn't bring him over more often or involve him more in family life. Her tone became accusatory, as though I was doing something wrong by maintaining boundaries. Then came the insinuations, her assumption that every night I spent out late with him was proof of something more sinister. She accused me of being reckless, of prioritizing physical intimacy over emotional connection, and of disrespecting myself and her. It was infuriating. Her judgments weren't just baseless. They were insulting. I felt like she wasn't just questioning my choices, but attacking my character. I wanted her to trust me, to respect the way I navigated relationships. Instead, she made me feel like I was constantly under surveillance, like nothing I did could ever be good enough in her eyes. And that's when the tension started to boil over. After New Year's Eve, it felt like every conversation with my mom turned into a subtle interrogation. She'd drop comments that seemed innocent enough on the surface, but they were laced with judgment. Why doesn't he come over more often? Is he avoiding us? Or, serious men value family involvement. At first, I tried to brush it off, answering her questions with patience and redirecting the conversation when her tone turned critical. But it became clear that no answer I gave was satisfactory. Her assumptions started to take a darker turn, centered on her belief that I was neglecting the proper way to handle a relationship. She seemed convinced that our late nights together meant one thing. I was prioritizing physical intimacy over everything else. The irony? We'd only been intimate once, on New Year's Eve of all nights, and even if that wasn't the case, it wasn't her business. But explaining this felt pointless. Her mind was already made up, and defending myself only seemed to fuel her narrative. This wasn't the first time her judgments about relationships had hurt me, but it felt more personal now. She wasn't just criticizing my boyfriend or our dynamic, she was attacking my choices, my values, and by extension, me. I found myself walking on eggshells, avoiding certain topics and carefully curating what I shared with her. Even so, the tension between us only grew. Her tone became sharper, her words more pointed. Every interaction felt like a test, and I was constantly failing in her eyes. The weight of her disapproval was overwhelming, and the space I'd tried to create between my relationship and her scrutiny was shrinking. I knew a confrontation was inevitable. I just didn't expect it to explode the way it did. It all came to a head one evening, after yet another tense conversation that spiraled out of control. I had just gotten home from spending time with my boyfriend. Nothing out of the ordinary, just dinner and a long walk. But to my mom, it was proof of everything she'd been accusing me of. She was waiting in the living room when I walked in, her expression a mix of frustration and disappointment. "So, where were you this time?" she asked, her voice heavy with insinuation. I sighed, knowing exactly where this was heading, but not in the mood to argue. "Out with him," I replied simply, hoping to end it there. But she didn't let it go. Her questions became sharper, her tone more confrontational. "Do you even think about what people might say? Coming home late like this every night?" she said, shaking her head. "Do you think that's how a respectable woman acts?" That's when she said it. The word that pushed me over the edge. "You're acting like a puta. That's what you want to be, isn't it?" I froze, stunned by how casually the words slipped from her mouth, like it was nothing. Like it wasn't a dagger aimed straight at me. The hurt was instant, but so was the anger. I'd spent weeks, months even, trying to navigate her criticisms with patience, trying to maintain some semblance of peace. But this crossed a line I couldn't ignore. "So that's what you think of me?" I shot back, my voice shaking. "Fine. If respecting myself and setting boundaries makes me a puta in your eyes, then I guess I'm a puta. Is that what you want to hear?" Her face turned red, her expression a mix of shock and indignation. But I wasn't done. The anger that had been simmering inside me erupted. "You act like you're the authority on relationships, but look where your way got you. 20 years of marriage to a man who cheated and moved on in less than a year. And now you're judging me for not wanting to end up like that?" I could see my words hit her like a slap, but I didn't feel relief, just exhaustion. I didn't know if I'd gone too far, but in that moment, I couldn't hold back anymore. The moment the words left my mouth, "Then I guess I'm a puta," the room fell into an almost deafening silence. My mom just stared at me, her face a mixture of shock and disbelief. I could feel my chest tightening, my heart racing from the sheer weight of what I'd just said. It wasn't planned. It wasn't even something I had thought about saying before. But in that moment, it felt like the only way to defend myself from the relentless criticism, the constant undermining of who I was. "I can't believe you'd say that to me," she finally said, her voice shaking. "After everything I've done for you. After the way I've raised you." Her words stung, but they also made me angrier. I'd tried so hard to maintain respect in our relationship, to explain myself calmly despite her constant attacks. And yet, she was the one who first hurled that insult at me. "I didn't want to say it," I replied, my voice quieter now but no less firm. "But you keep pushing me, Mom. You keep reducing me to some version of myself that doesn't exist. You don't listen. You don't try to understand. You just assume the worst." She scoffed, crossing her arms. "Well, what am I supposed to think? You stay out late. You don't bring him here. What kind of impression are you giving?" I took a deep breath, trying to keep my composure. "The kind of impression that I'm an adult who knows how to manage her own life." The kind of impression that I don't need to meet your timeline or your expectations to live a life that's valid and meaningful. For a moment, I thought she might actually hear me, that something might finally click. But instead, she shook her head, muttering something under her breath about respect and family values. It was in that moment that I realized how deeply entrenched her beliefs were, how no amount of explaining or reasoning could break through the wall she had built. And as much as it hurt, I knew I had to stop trying to win her approval. After the fight, I couldn't stop replaying everything in my head. Her words, my response, the silence that followed. For a long time, I just sat alone in my room, trying to make sense of it all. That's when my thoughts shifted to her past, and how much of it shaped the person she is today. My mom's life hasn't been easy. She married young, full of hope and love, only to spend 20 years in a marriage that eventually betrayed her. My dad, the so-called man of the family, turned out to be anything but. He cheated on her, shattered her trust, and moved on so quickly it felt like their decades together had meant nothing. I started to realize that her obsession with relationships, her fixation on the right way to handle them, wasn't just about me. It was her way of trying to make sense of her own pain, of trying to protect me from making what she sees as her mistakes. In her mind, if I follow the rules, her rules, I'll avoid the heartbreak and humiliation she endured. But that's the irony. Her rules didn't save her. They didn't make her marriage stronger or her husband more faithful. And instead of recognizing that, she clings to them even harder, projecting those expectations onto me like they're a lifeline. I don't think she understands how much that pressure weighs on me. It's like she sees my independence as a rejection of her values, her sacrifices, and even her love. But the truth is, I've learned from her pain. I've just drawn different conclusions. She taught me, unintentionally, that relationships aren't guarantees, that people can promise forever and still leave. And that's why I approach them cautiously on my own terms. Not because I don't value love, but because I refuse to lose myself in it. As much as I try to empathize with her, I can't ignore the damage her judgments cause. It's a constant struggle, balancing understanding her past with standing firm in my present. And after everything, I wonder, is there even a way to bridge the gap between us? In the hours after our argument, regret began to creep in. Not because I didn't mean what I said. If anything, it felt like I had finally stood up for myself in a way I hadn't before. But the way it came out, the sheer anger behind my words, left a bitter taste in my mouth. I didn't want to hurt her. Despite everything, she's my mom, and I know her harshness comes from a place of fear and her own unresolved pain. But the constant accusations, the endless assumptions, had left me so exhausted that I couldn't hold back anymore. I replayed the moment over and over in my head, wishing I'd chosen different words or a calmer tone. But would it have mattered? She's so deeply set in her beliefs, so unwilling to see me for who I truly am, that no amount of explanation seems to get through. What frustrated me the most wasn't even the fight itself. It was how predictable it all felt. This cycle of judgment and defensiveness has been a part of our relationship for as long as I can remember. And every time I think we might finally understand each other, something drags us back to square one. I wanted to fix things, but how could I, when her idea of resolution is for me to conform to her expectations? How do you make peace with someone who refuses to see the validity of your choices, your independence? As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I wondered if things between us would ever change. I wanted to believe they could. But deep down, I wasn't sure if either of us knew how to meet in the middle. As I sit here reflecting on everything that happened, I can't help but feel conflicted. On one hand, I know I was defending myself, standing up against years of judgment and criticism that had finally pushed me to my breaking point. On the other hand, I can't shake the guilt of how harsh my words were, especially considering they were directed at my own mother. I keep asking myself, was I wrong? Did I go too far? Or was I justified in finally snapping after being cornered for so long? The truth is, I don't have the answers. What I do know is that our fight wasn't just about this one moment. It was about years of unspoken tension, clashing values, and unresolved pain. It was about her projecting her fears onto me, and me fighting to protect the life I've worked so hard to build for myself. I want her to see me for who I am, not through the lens of her expectations or her past. But I also know how much of her identity is tied to those things, and asking her to let go of them might be asking for the impossible. So now I'm turning to you. You've heard my side of the story, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I've tried to explain myself as honestly as I can, but maybe I'm too close to the situation to see it clearly. Tell me, am I the jerk? Was I wrong for snapping the way I did, or was I just defending myself? I don't know if there's a right or wrong answer, but I'd love to hear what you think. Because if there's one thing I've learned from this, it's that sometimes the people closest to us are the hardest to understand.